Hello everybody, and welcome back to my how to create your own card game GameMaker tutorial series. In this video we're going to create a variable hand and an interactive deck that when you click on it will draw a card. We'll also learn how to print your deck out so that you can see it and also shuffle your deck. And in the next video we will learn how to create this type of animation and cards that we can move around. So if you're interested in following this series, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. In the last video, this is where we left off. We had our deck printed and our hand printed. So before we begin, there are a few changes that I want to make. And those quick changes are going to be, first in our draw event, I have it drawing out the card sprite of the card in the deck instead of the back. So I'm going to change that to card back. And I also want it to print the deck in a certain direction. So I want to change this minus sign to a plus sign. And the last thing I want to change is in the hand object. I would like to change this 5 to a 3. So if you did all that, you should have this in your game. So now the deck is printed upwards and towards the right, and the space between our cards has been a little narrowed. So the first thing I want to show you is how to print your deck like this. Doing this will allow us to see the deck change as we shuffle it. So in order to do that, we need to make a few additions to our deck object. So first off, we want to create a variable sprite for the cards in our deck. So instead of using the sprite card back, I'm going to create a variable called card sprite equals card back. So this will be the default sprite for the cards in the deck. Now, I'm going to create this condition that if I want the cards to be face up, I will print the actual sprites of the card. So I'm also going to have this other variable that I have not initialized yet, and if that variable is 1, the card sprite will equal the card sprite of the card in that deck position. Because if you remember from the last video, this is a for loop that's going to go from the beginning position of our deck to the last position of our deck and print every single card. So this for loop will go through every single card in the deck, printing the card in that position. So we're going to change this from being the card back sprite to the variable card sprite. Now, I want to initialize this variable in the beginning. The default value for this variable will be 0. So our deck will always print the sprite back, the sprite card back, as the default. I'm going to leave a comment here saying that if face up is equal to 1, cards in deck will be face up. So now in order to change this variable from 0 to 1, I need to create a new event. And in the event that I'm going to use for this is a step event. Now you use your step event for most of the logic in your game. So now what I want to do is create a condition that will make the face up variable equal to 1. And I also want to create another condition to return it back to its normal state. Now, the condition I'm going to use is I'm just going to select a button on my keyboard to force this variable to change. So to do that, I'm going to use a GameMaker function called keyboard check released. Now, this function you can see at the bottom is looking for a key. Now, the key I want to use is the up arrow button on my keyboard, and that's represented as VK_up. Now, if you want to know the other buttons that you could use, you could middle select this, and it'll open up a help tab, and it will show you all of the different buttons you can use. So, if I push the up arrow, whenever it releases, this code will compute. Now, in order to force the face up variable to be 0, I'm going to use that function again. But instead, I will be using the down button. Now, using the word released in this function, you will learn that it is very important to pick the correct action, because you can do pressed or released. As soon as you press the up button, it'll happen. Or if you put it as released, as soon as you let go of the button, whatever's in those curly brackets will happen. So now, whenever I do this, whenever I load my game and I press these buttons, we should see the deck change from being face down to being face up. So let's see if that happens. So I'm going to push the up button, and you see my deck prints. You can see the top of the cards. And if I push the down button, it'll go back down. So this helps us see the deck, but now what I want to do is see all of the deck. So in order to do that, I need to create a different buffer, or a variable buffer. If you remember, what we did in the last video is we chose the buffer size to be 0.4. So in the instance where I want to see the cards in my deck, I don't want the buffer to be 0.4. I want it to be larger so I can see more of the card. So I'm actually going to create a variable called deck buffer X and deck buffer Y. And then I'm going to go to my create event, and I'm going to initialize those variables to equal what I originally had. So I've effectively changed nothing. I've just created a new variable, or two new variables. Now I'm going to go back to the step event, and in my code I'm going to also change that buffer depending on if I push the up button or if I push the down button. So if I push the up button, I want to see all the cards in my deck. So I'm going to change my deck buffer X to equal negative card width -5. And then when I push it down, I want it to return to its natural state. So I'm going to change that to deck buffer X is equal to 0.4. Now, I chose negative card width -5 because when it's here, I need the deck cards to move in towards the left in order to see all of the cards, because if they move towards the right, I won't be able to see them. They'll be off the screen. And I didn't change my Y position because I want it to stay on that direct line. So let's see what this looks like. So if I push the up button, all of my deck will print outwards. And if I push the down button, it will move back to its original state. So this will help us when we want to shuffle our deck. So now let's get into deck shuffling. So I'm going to create another condition in the step event to shuffle my deck. Now these conditions won't be used in the actual game. This will just be used for testing. So I'm going to use another keyboard check released function to do this. And instead of up or down, I'm going to use left. So whenever I press the left button, I want the deck to be shuffled. Now, this is the script I'm going to use to shuffle my deck. But if you see that it's blue, that means it's not created yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create that script like we did in the last video. So I'm going to go to my scripts tab. I'm going to right select and select create script. And I'm going to name it SCR for script and then shuffle deck. Now, the first thing I want to do is initialize a local variable. And I'm going to create that, and that variable is going to be called numShuffle. Now this variable is how many times I want the deck to be shuffled. So I'm going to set that to a number. So whenever this deck is shuffled, I want it to be shuffled 100 times. Now, next I'm going to create conditions where I don't want to shuffle my deck. So if my deck count is equal to 0, return. If there are no cards in the deck, don't shuffle it. So that's the only condition I'll have to not shuffle the deck. Now to shuffle the deck, I need to use two different for loops. So typically we have for I equals 0 and I is less than some number. In this case, this will be the numShuffle variable, I++. Now, since we need to do this twice, if I were to do for I equals 0 and I is less than deck count, I++, this won't work because it will look at both of these i's as the same value. So what we need to do is change one of these. So typically if you already use 1, or if you already are using I, the next one you'll use is J. That's just kind of standard. And if you're using 3, you use I, J, and then Z is typically what you will see. So the first for loop will do whatever's within these curly brackets this number of times. So we've set the number of shuffles we want to be as 100. So it's going to shuffle 100 times. So everything in here is going to be that action shuffle. So I'm going to comment this as shuffle action. Now, in order to do that, this is the code you will need to shuffle all of the cards in the deck. Now, the deck is just an array. So what you want to do is select a random card in that deck. And what we're going to do is we're going to shuffle one card at a time. And we're going to go through the whole deck doing that. So what we're going to do is create another local variable. We're going to call it temp1 because this is the only time we're going to use it. You can come up with fancy variable names if you want, but if you're going to use it for only a short amount of time, I find temp1, temp2 easier So we're going to make temp1 equal to a random number in the deck. So that function we're going to use is going to be called irandom range, and within that it needs two values. So it's going to create a random number between the first value and the second value. And the first value I want to be is the beginning of the deck, and the last value is the end of the deck. So it'll select a random card in your deck, or a random position in your deck. This is just a position in the deck that we're going to use. And then wherever we currently are in the deck, because we're going through every single position in the deck, we're going to swap that random card with our current position of the deck. So our current position is deck I. Now, if this is greater than 0, as in there is a card there, because if you go through your whole deck, if you hit a 0 card, that means there is no card in that position. So you don't want to shuffle a card in a position where there should be no card. And if the position, the random position, is greater than 0, so both of these values, or both of these positions in the deck, is a valid position to be at. There are cards in these positions. Then we will shuffle those, or we will swap them, which effectively shuffles those two cards. So what we're going to do is create another temp variable, and we're going to set that to our current deck card that we're looking at. So the position that we're in of the deck, that card, we're going to set as this temp2 variable. Now, what we're going to do is, since we stored that value, we can now change it. So we're going to say that that position we currently are is going to be equal to the new position, or the new value that was randomly chosen. But then we've got to set that random position of the deck to a new value. So we're going to say deck temp1 is going to be equal to temp2. So now we've effectively just swapped those two cards. And we have an error here, which is what's making our variables not turn yellow, and that's because I typed if here. So let's remove that. So if I were to remove that, everything's okay, and this local variable has been created. So now we have shuffled those two positions, and it's going to go through each position of the deck and shuffle it however many times you chose in the beginning. So it's going to go through your deck 100 times and shuffle it. And that's all it is. So now, if we hit the play button and we go into the room, and we expand our deck by pushing the up button, since we created that new condition for the left key, if we press the left key, we should see our deck shuffle. As you can see, the cards are moving around, and every position is changing. So we have effectively learned to shuffle our deck, and we can shuffle it as many times as we want. So now what we want to do is, we have this static hand here, but what we actually want is we want our hand to be dependent on the cards we draw from the deck. So what I want to do is, I want to remove what we have initialized for our hand and create a condition to where if I were to click on this deck, it would draw a card for me, and I would see my hand expand. So what we're going to do now is go to our hand object. So in our hand object, we have initialized our hand to have cards. Now we want to remove that. if we hit the play button, we will see that there are no cards in our hand now. But we can still see our deck and shuffle it and hide it. So what we want to do now is create code that says if the deck is clicked on, draw a card. So in order to do that, we need to go back to our deck. Now there's an easy way to do this and there's a hard way to do this. The hard way would be similar to what we've done up here. If instead of using the keyboard, we're going to use mouse check button released MB left if the mouse coordinates are in this defined position that we don't know, draw a card. Now, we don't want to do that because we'd have to map out each of the positions in the field. And in order to do that, like in the last video, we'd have to figure out the coordinate at this point and the coordinate at this point and create a long condition that says if the mouse is in this defined space, draw a card. We can do that, but there's an easier way. So GameMaker Studio has an event called mouse left released. What this does is if the sprite of the object has had the mouse left button released on the sprite, it will do whatever action is in this. Now, the way I had it before is if it was generally done, if I were to put if mouse check button released blah blah blah, it would be generalized no matter where I am. If I release the mouse button, whatever's in this text, whatever's in this condition will be done. And that's why I would have to put if the mouse coordinate is in a certain position, and if the Y position is within a few coordinates, then do this. So this event effectively does that for you. But in order to do that, you have to put a sprite on the deck. So what I'm going to do is remove all of the cards in the deck so we can see how I accomplish this. So I'm going to remove the deck from being drawn. And you can do this by creating these two symbols from the beginning of the text you want to comment out and the end of the text you want to comment out. And it will comment everything between those two symbols. But everything after it will still be seen by the compiler. So if I hit the play button, you'll see that the deck is no longer being printed. So this area right here is where I want my deck to be drawn. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up this image in Paint and select the deck slot here and crop it around there so that I can use this image and just overlay it here seamlessly so you won't see it. So if you were to go to your project folder, and wherever you leave your images, if you right select it and select edit, you can go into Paint and then choose the select and select around this, drag it to the corner, make it fit perfectly, and then crop around it. And then save this image. Now, I've already done this, so what I'm going to do is create a new sprite, and I'm going to label this sprite SPR deck. And I'm going to import the image, select the origin, lock it into place, and I'm not going to have to change the size because the image was already in the size of the field. So just cropping it will give me the same size that it will be in the field. So now I'm going to go up to my deck, select this No Sprite button, and select the Sprite deck. So now this has a sprite. So I'm going to show you that even though I gave it a sprite, you still won't see it in the room. As you can see, this is where my deck is, or where it is supposed to be. But we don't see it say deck. It still says trash. In order to make it show up in the draw event, you have to use the function draw self. So once you do that and hit the play button, you'll find that it now says deck, because where we placed the deck, or where we placed our deck before, was right on the position of the trash pile. So you see it says deck now. This is actually the object we created. Now that we've done that, we can use this event. So in this event, what we want to do is call a function called draw. As you can see by its blue color that this script has not been created yet. So what we want to do is create a script. We're going to call it draw. Now, what we want to do is take the top card of our deck and put it in our hand. Now, in order to do that, we've got to take the top value of our deck, save it to a variable, zero it out, and put it in the next free position in our hand. Sounds complicated. Let me show you in the code. Now, the first thing I want to do is create a local variable, and I'm going to call it num for the amount of cards we want to draw. If we wanted to draw 1, we would put 1 in these parentheses. If we wanted to draw 5, we would pass a 5 to it. But since we only want to draw 1 card, I'm going to put 1 there. That 1 value will be read in to this local variable. And you do that by setting it to you do that by setting it equal to argument 0. If you were to put a second variable in here, you'd set it equal to argument 1, and so on. So, the first thing we want to put is our conditions to not draw a card. Now, the first one is if the number of cards you want to draw will will make you draw more cards than you actually have in your deck, that would be a problem, because then you'd be drawing nothing. You'd be trying to read a value that isn't there, and that will crash your game. So if that were to happen, we want to not do this action. So we're going to hit return if that is the case. The next time we wouldn't want to do that is if the hand count is at the max value that we set for our cards, the max value that we set to put for our cards. So we have not set that yet, but we will. So if we have the max amount of cards in our hand, return, because we wouldn't have a place to put this new card. So this blue text means I have not initialized this yet. So what I want to do is in my hand object, in the create event, I want to set a macro which acts as a global variable, and I want to call it max hand. Now this is the maximum amount of cards we can have in our hand at one time, and we're going to set that equal to 8. So if this was done correctly, the max hand will turn red. And if I go back down to my function, you'll see that it turned red. So since this is a global variable, I don't have to put this object hand in front of it. Now, what this does is when I put object hand, period, that will take whatever value is in this object denoted after the period. So since I'll be using this not in the hand function, I'll be using this in the deck function, I need to somehow connect that to the hand values. And that's done by doing this, calling out the name of the object, followed by period, followed by the variable you want. Hand count exists in the hand object here. So that's what it will be looking for. Now, if we want to draw a card, well, for every card that we want to draw, so if I is equal to 0 and I is less than num, which is the number of cards we want to draw, I plus plus. Now what we want to do is take the next position of our hand. So we want to reference our hand object. We want to change our hand value, and we want the next available position in our hand. Now the next available position will be our total hand count. And we want to set that equal to the top position of our deck. So now we've set the next position of our hand to equal the top card of the deck. So now let's see if this will allow us to draw a card. So we haven't uncommented our deck out, so we aren't able to see it. But since we have the sprite there, if we select this spot, we should draw a card. So let's see if it will allow us. So if we select this deck, we see that it doesn't allow us to draw a card. Well, we are drawing a card, but we can't see it. That's because of two reasons. When we draw a card, we want to increment our hand size because we have a new card in our hand. So the number of cards in our hand should be incremented. The next reason why we wouldn't be able to draw a card is because even though we are incrementing our hand, the position that we're pulling from the deck is a 0 card. So that's because the deck count does not account for the 0 value. And programming, 0 is the first position of any array, if you set it that way, and that's the way we set it. But typically, the 0 position is the first position. So that means when I use the variable deck count, I am taking the position before the last card in the deck. So in order to take the one under it, I want to decrement it one time before we draw from the deck. So as you can see, these two are in the front of this variable, and these two are behind this variable. I'll explain that after I show you how this works. So now if I select the deck, I will draw a card. But one thing I want to do before I better explain this is I want to reprint the deck so we can see what's actually happening. And then I'll explain the incrementing and decrementing. So let's put this back in. And let me explain this. So when I put this after the variable, it will increment it after it goes through this line of code. So effectively, this will be the same thing. Let me just copy this and paste this. This does the same thing. Now the difference between these two is if I want to do this exact same thing, what's actually happening when I put it before the variable is if I were to do this. This is the same exact thing as what I had before, but it saves an extra line of code, which is why I put it here. So if I hit the play button, we'll see that it will act the same way. So if I select the deck, I'm still drawing a card. Now, let's see what's actually happening. So if I select this, you see that I'm now selecting cards from my deck, and they're going away. Now, this is a little bit of a problem where we have it now. Yes, it looks like we're taking from the top of the deck and removing it, but these cards that we've just drawn are actually still in our deck. And the only reason why it's not showing that is because we're decrementing our deck count. So, let me show you. If we go back to our deck, and instead of putting the deck count here, if I were to put whatever the max deck size is, which is 60, here instead of deck count, we'll see that those cards don't actually go away, which can be problematic later on. So if I select this, you'll see that the deck is no longer getting shorter. So let's look at this one more time. Since we've created a shuffle function, let's see it work. So before, we just picked the top cards in the deck. So that was Bulbasaur, which is off the screen, we can't see, Charmander, Squirtle. Now, let's shuffle it. We're actually here at this Bulbasaur position. So let's shuffle the deck. And we've changed it to a Charmander, or now to a Squirtle. So now if I draw a card, I draw the Squirtle. And the next would be the Bulbasaur, and then the Charmander. But those cards should be disappearing, but they're not. So the reason why we want it to disappear is, let's change this back to deck point. Let me make sure that was actually there. Yep, no, it was deck count. So let's change that back to deck count. And in the shuffle function we created, or the shuffle script, this is reading in, and if the position is greater than 0, and if the new position is greater than 0, shuffle it. So if we were to shuffle those positions that should have been cleared, we would be shuffling cards out of the deck because they're now outside of the perceived amount of cards we have in our deck. So even though we're using deck count here, it should stay within that confinement. We just want to be extra sure or redundant and make sure that that is an impossibility. So now let's clear that value from the deck. So in order to do that, we need to put deck at the deck count, which is what we've taken from, and set it equal to 0. So now if I change this back to 60, which would still print every single card in the deck, we will see that the cards will disappear correctly, like they didn't before. See, they're disappearing. So we're in a way making it redundant, which is making it more reliable. So now let me show you with shuffling again that we can see that we're actually going to take whatever's here. Pick the Charmander, then the Squirtle, then the Charmander again. So now that we've done that, let's create a variable hand position, because you see how it's kind of going off of the screen. We don't want that. We'd like it to be in the center all the time to make it look like we're actually holding some cards. So we would like the first card to be in the immediate center, and then have the cards be pushed out so it's centered in the middle. In order to do that, we need to go to our hand object, and we need to change this code around. So what I want to do is create new variables for my X position and my Y position. So my X position is going to be equal to 180, and my Y position is going to be equal to 750. And let's change these, and let's change it over here as well. Now we want our Y position to stay in the same spot, and we only want our X position to change. So in order to keep the cards in the dead center of the field, we're going to use this equation. So we're going to take half of the room width. Room width is a variable built into the object, or built into the program, or that's built into your game, and that will be the width of your room. You can do the same with the height. And we're going to subtract that from half of our hand count. And it's going to be a long equation, but I'll explain it after. And we're going to multiply it by the card width plus two additional pixels. And then we're going to add half of the card width. Now, before I explain it, let's see how that looks in our game to see if it actually works. That did not, because I did not write the variable name properly. So let's try it with the correct variable name here. And that's why you always want to initialize any variables you may use. Your game will crash just like that. So I draw my first card. As you can see, it's in the center of the field. If I draw my second card, you'll see this card shift over just a little bit, like it did. So now we can see that this is the center of the field. So now we've created a variable hand and a variable hand position. So if I keep drawing cards, my hand will be stationed exactly in the middle. And as you can see, I can't draw any more cards because I set my hand max equal to 8. So now let's explain this equation. So what this function effectively does is it takes half of the room width, and then depending on how many cards are in my hand, it moves it by the width that I want to have in between my cards multiplied by half of my hand count, because I want half to be on the left side of my room and the other half to be on the right side. So that's why I divided by 2. But when I divide it by 2, I'm effectively taking half of the card space, and I want to adjust that so it's not cut off. Now, it's hard to visualize, but if I were to take this off, you'll see that the cards won't be in the position I want them to be in. You'll see that it'll come off of the room and just before the end. So you'll see that it's actually cut off by half of a card width. So in order to adjust that, that's why I've added this at the end, so that it creates the perfect distances in my room. And as you can see, the deck is also getting smaller. So this lines up perfectly here, and this lines up perfectly here. So this is all I wanted to go over in this video. In the next video, I'll show you how we can make our cards in our hand individualistic. And what I mean by that is our hand is one object. Now what you would want in a card game is to have each card have its own object. And if you do that, you can make the game play more like an actual card game. So what that would look like is this. You see how the cards are all independent of each other. And I can also create this little animation to create a more realistic draw animation. So if you want to see that again, this is what it looks like. And then whenever we decide to play the cards, we are able to drag them wherever we want to set them. So if you found this interesting, hit the like button and subscribe. The next video will be out next week. And if you would like me to elaborate on anything, please comment down below, and I'll do my best to help you out. So until next time.